Welcome to The Secret Witch Show, the podcast providing a safe and alchemical altar space of conversations which help powerful women escape a half-hearted, spiritless society and rediscover the freedom of living a wildly magical life. Every other week, we explore how to cast aside the wounds of shame, guilt, and fear connected with fully being yourself, so you can grant yourself permission to stop hiding, ground soulfully back into your body, illuminate your whole soul desires, tend your soul, rediscover and reclaim your powerful gifts, express your magic, and manifest your wildest alchemy. There's no better place to become who your heart longs to be. This is where we will guide you into liberation. I'm your host, Nicole Barton, and I'm so excited to dive in. Hello and welcome, magical ones. This week I've really been feeling how my women have come here for a life of magic, but found that they have been trying to fit their magic into a mundane box to make it more palatable to the world, often to avoid being seen as a charlatan. And I'm leaning deeper into dosing the Wild Apothecary path to those women who have a sense that they are here to be remedies for themselves and for the world. Those women who have a burning phosphoric fire to become unapologetically magical. So in November, I'll be leading a journey called Invoke Your Wild Apothecary for those women who want to heal all the parts of themselves that have been suppressed, those whose magic has been innocently lying dormant so that they can express their full magical selves. If that's you, to join us, take a look at www.nicolebarton.co.uk/wild-apothecary. On The Secret Witch Show today, though, our guest is Dean Radin. Dean is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Associated Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and Chairman of the biotech company Cognogenics. He has earned a Master's in Electrical Engineering and a PhD in Psychology, and in 2022 was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Science from the Swami Vivekananda University in Bangalore, India, an institution of higher learning accredited by the Indian government and specialising in yoga practice and research. He is author or co-author of some 300 scientific and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters and 9 books, 4 of which have been translated into 15 foreign languages, including the bestseller Real Magic. In this episode, we explore the key question at the forefront of every secret witch's mind. Is magic actually real? And can magic really be measured by science? And is it even helpful to measure it in that way? This paradigm-shifting episode explores magic in a way that will help you come to love both magic and science, which is heartwarmingly healing for all those magical ones who have doubted and resisted both at times. Let's dive in. Welcome, Dean. I am so honoured to have you here. Honestly, your brilliance is so welcome. And one of the things that our listeners often struggles with quite a bit is the idea of magic being real, which I know you've written many fascinating books about. So I thought this is the man to speak to. And I particularly also loved that your book, Real Magic, describes your work as The Secret, only a little bit more realistic and scientific. So I loved that when I read that. So yeah, I'm really excited to dive in with you today. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I would love, you've got a really interesting journey. So I think a good place that I always like to start with guests is just to begin to invite them to share a little bit about their background. So anything about your background and your relationship with magic and science that feels relevant to our conversation here. So yeah, I don't know if that feels an aligned place to start with you.
Sure.
Perfect.
Sure.
Excellent.
So I think your opening, you were suggesting that one of the problems that people in modern society have is that they may dabble with ideas about magic, but they also have a lot of doubts as to whether or not any of that is true. And this is partially because the scientific worldview does not allow for magic. And science works really well. Our technologies are based on it. And if we set up a incompatibility between what science is telling us what is possible versus not, versus our own experience, it doesn't help either science or magic. It just creates barriers in both directions. So, like a lot of kids, when I was a kid growing up, I read a lot of fairy tales and science fiction. The last generation is probably reading more about Harry Potter. And some, like myself, would be thinking, I wonder if any of that stuff is real. So obviously, it's not like what we see on superhero movies and even Harry Potter. We don't think that is literally real. But is there any truth to that at all? And so I wondered that too as a child. I was also very interested in science and mathematics. And at that point, as a child, all the way up almost to graduate school, I was playing the violin. I was on the concert violinist track. I mean, that's basically what I thought I was going to be, until I started asking around for people who I knew who were professional musicians, and all of them said, if you're not really passionate about this, don't do it. This is way too difficult a life to have if you can do something else. So I said, oh, okay, I like science and engineering and mathematics. So I turned music into a hobby rather than a profession. And one of the consequences of that was that I learned the tools and techniques that you learn as a scientist and as an engineer on how to study things. So it gave me the opportunity to take this childhood interest in, is magic real, and figure out that there actually are ways of studying it. In fact, there's an entire discipline that's been around since at least the late 1800s, where scientists have been studying whether the phenomena of magic, which we generally will call psychic phenomena, is that true or not? Well, it turns out that it is true. Using the same techniques that science uses to study things like perception and cognition and human performance and human behavior and a whole list of things that science is quite good at studying, the same techniques have been applied to psychic phenomena, and we find that they exist. They're pretty much distributed in population in the same way that sports or musical talent are distributed. So what does this have to do with magic? Well, my most recent book, Real Magic, the case that I'm making is that if you look at magical practices all the way from shamanism to today, so we're talking tens of thousands of years, the practices fall into three categories. There is a practice of divination. So the stereotype here is looking into a crystal ball. That's a magical practice. In modern terms, we would call that things like clairvoyance or precognition. It's perceiving through space and time. So the science that has been applied to divination shows very clearly that clairvoyance, otherwise known today more like remote viewing, which is the same thing, and precognition, they are real phenomena. They are generally pretty weak in most people, but as with any kind of talent, some people are really, really good at it. They're quite good at it. So the second category of magical practice is called force of will, which in the magical traditions is all about what could be called destiny engineering. Like when you pick up a grimoire with a book of spells, the spells are all about getting something that you want. It's changing the physical world in some way so you get what you want. So it might be that you want money, or you want a job, or you want sex, or you want healing, or you want something, anything. The spells are rituals designed to focus your mind to help you get that. That's also the basis of virtually the entire book genre of affirmations.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
That's what it is. And it traces directly back into the magical tradition. So in the scientific sense, what we want to know is, does your attention and intention change the physical world in measurable ways? So the short answer there is yes, it does. And there's a huge range of experiments and different kinds of physical targets that have been used. including things like human physiology, human health, and even human behavior. So yeah, so that exists as well. And the third category of magical practice is called theurgy, and that's all about communicating with spirits and asking them to do things on your behalf or get information. So in that sense, science is lagging because we don't yet know that there are spirits. We don't have easy ways of testing that. But the closest that we've come is the range of experiments and anecdotes on suggesting survival of consciousness after bodily death. So the ones that I've been personally most involved with are mediumship studies. So these are psychics who specialize in communicating with the departed. And under double and triple blind conditions, you're able to show that some mediums are very good at getting information that is correct, that can be verified as correct, from people who are departed. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting information from spirits, because there's other interpretations. It could be telepathy, it could be a whole bunch of other things. But it's not due to cold reading, it's not due to fraud. They can actually do it. So at least as that range of magical practice, we don't have scientific evidence that would say, yeah, we're highly certain. But in the two other categories of divination and force of will, we have very strong evidence that both of those things are actually real.
Wow, I love this so much. Like, yeah, I can just feel the excitement just in me as well. But yeah, I certainly can feel the impact of just that statement, like magic is real, for so many women who have kind of, been on this journey into their witch and kind of kept her hidden in this little box because there's just this kind of, they feel that they're just not approved of, that there's some doubt over magic being real. And shamed themselves for it. So that feels just so, that statement, like magic is real and we can measure it, it feels so healing on many levels. And I love that. I also love that you said you kind of had this kind of interest right from when you were a little boy, I guess, in childhood. I love that. And it seems to be always the way that that we kind of, if we're drawn to magic, we did at least have some kind of interest in it somehow, I think, when we were younger. So where to go?
I mean, all you need to look at is the success of Harry Potter as a book series. It's rivals the Bible in terms of the number of books sold and the number of translations.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really astonishing. And what it shows is that and this was not just read by children, it's read by probably as many adults. There's a very strong underlying feeling in most people that something like magic is real. And this is reflected also in television shows and in movies. Like every other movie or television show has some sort of paranormal, supernatural, magical element to it. So one of the things that happens when there is a real phenomenon that is forced to go underground, it becomes esoteric, is when the society, for one reason or another, is saying, no, we're not going to pay any attention to this stuff. We're going to call it a cult. We're going to sort of hide it away. Well, you can't hide something that's true. It comes out in other forms. And the form that it is coming out now, and has always been this way, is through entertainment and fiction. That's how it comes out. And so it's not surprising then that as a domain of the entertainment world, magical concepts are one of the primary themes that pop up again and again. And we, as if like, for example, if there was something that was so alien that nobody would resonate with it, then it would not be shown as part of entertainment, because people would look at it and say, what in the world is that? They wouldn't have any way of feeling that it's true. But in this case, as with much of mythology, we do feel that is true because it is telling something that has been around for a very long time, mostly suppressed, but it's also very culture specific. So in Western culture, where science is the dominant arbiter of truth, science says, and of course, science is not monolithic. I'm a scientist, I believe in magic because that's what I study. But the way that science is portrayed typically in the major journals and oftentimes in television is portrayed as though this stuff is only believed by people who are uneducated or delusional in some way. And yet studies have shown that the first statement about education, that nobody could possibly believe in psychic phenomena or magic or any of that stuff if they're educated. The correlation is actually positive with education. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to believe in psychic phenomena. Whether that's also true in magic, I'm not so sure, because the connection between the psychic and the magic is not as well known. That's why I wrote the book about this, showing that it's actually the same thing. So much of the arguments made by what we can call a scientific mainstream about things psychic and magical are, sad to say, based on ignorance, because there's plenty of evidence out there, not anecdotal evidence, but empirical evidence in journals showing that when you do experiments in these things, you find that the phenomena are real. In other cultures, you have a very different sense. You can embrace the value of science, but for example, a few days ago, I gave a talk in India, where in India, these topics are no big deal. This is baked into the culture for thousands of years. And so ironically, the number of people in India who are scientists who are studying these phenomena is extremely small, much smaller than it is in the Western world, which is kind of strange because the culture accepts it, and yet there's hardly any experimentation going on. And so part of the reason for that is that many of the academics in India have been trained in Western methods. And even though they might personally accept magic, they find that that's not a topic that can be studied in the academic world. It's like not part of the curriculum. So they don't study it. They might practice it, but they don't study it, which I always thought was a little bit strange.
That is fascinating, actually. Yeah, there's so many places I could go here. I think the first question that springs to mind is, what's your sense of why magic is suppressed?
Well, one of the reasons it's suppressed is because it's frightening. When you think about what magic is about, it's about manipulation of others or manipulation of the physical world, which was frightening if you think that that's actually possible. There are also positive aspects to it, like healing. Either local or remote healing is possible, but the flip side is always available. Local or remote anti-healing. In other words, you can damage somebody at a distance. Well, that would freak anybody out. So there's a certain degree of fear associated with this. The other part is that there's a very long history of fraud associated with people who make these claims. So it is perfectly reasonable to be skeptical and not gullible about somebody saying they're doing magic when they're actually not. And there are plenty of people who take advantage of beliefs about these things. Another problem is that some of the magical traditions are about revealing secrets, and everyone carries secrets with them. In fact, our whole civilization, at least Western, actually everywhere, I think, civilization relies on keeping secrets. Imagine a government that always told you exactly the truth. There is no such thing. And imagine people who do that. There's like business and government and the law and everything involved in modern society would not work the way that it currently does if there were no secrets. And yet, magical abilities, psychic abilities are all about revealing of secrets. Like telepathy, for example. If you can know what somebody is feeling or thinking, well, then there's no secret there. And in fact, this was part of the US government's program called Stargate, the classified program that was doing psychic espionage. Well, that was all about using psychics to determine other people's secrets, and it works.
Wow, that's amazing.
You think about all of these, the fears, the challenge to the status quo, this challenge to the academic world, the challenge to religious lore or religious doctrine For example, in Catholicism, uses magic in practically every ritual that they do. The ritual of the Eucharist is explicitly a magical practice, but you can only do that if you're anointed in a certain way to become a priest. Otherwise, if you don't do that, and you look at the catechism, it says you absolutely don't do anything about magic. It's demonic. Well, you stand back from the religion in general. You see religion as kind of a social control structure, which it sort of is. It has spiritual aspects too, but it also has a lot of social control. You can see why the catechism was written in that way, because you don't want people challenging the authority of the church. And so religious people will want nothing to do with this topic and will suppress it, or worse. Science doesn't want to have anything to do with it because many scientists don't think that it's compatible with what we understand about science. The general public, business, government are concerned about it for the fears that I've already talked about. So there are many, many good reasons for why this topic has been pushed underground and why people are reluctant to talk about it.
I love that. I'd never thought of it like that before. And yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm just trying to imagine. And funnily enough, I went to a medium developmentship circle last night, and they were actually talking about a similar thing. I'd like, what would the world actually look like if everybody believed in magic? Like, it would just be a completely different place, wouldn't
it? It would operate in a very different way, right? And so anything that challenges the status quo in any domain is going to be resisted. And as I already said, this challenges so many of the status quos of modern civilization that it's not surprising that it's been suppressed. So that said, what's interesting is that the UK has the highest density of people doing research in the academic world on psychic phenomena.
Wow.
And there is also a very large underground in the UK, actually everywhere in the world, but the UK in particular I'm thinking of, is that there are neo-pagans, there are witches, there are many groups that are involved sub rosa explicitly in magic. In fact, there's a new organization starting soon, based in the UK, a nonprofit organization explicitly created for the study of esoteric practices. And so I'm an advisor for that organization, because what is very refreshing here is that it's not simply a matter of practitioners who want to get together and do magic. They want to apply the tools of science to magic to find out what works, what doesn't work, what kind of people work best, what all of the questions that you would naturally think of as, okay, if magic is real, then how do we begin to understand what it is? Like, how can that be real? What is it? All of those questions arise. And this is an organization that will bring together practitioners and scientists and scholars to try to answer those questions.
Wow.
And it will have some funding to support research.
Excellent.
So it's, so it will be a worldwide effort. There'll be a website that talks about it, and sometime near the end of the year.
Yeah, I love that. I'm very excited to hear more about that. One of the things that just strikes me as you're saying that is one of the things that because I used to kind of have this kind of where the secret witch is now in perhaps that kind of anti-science. I used to be very much that kind of way. And then my partner is very much, he loves science. So he's been able to help me kind of alchemize those views about science. But he kind of describes it that science is magic is everything that science can't yet explain in some ways. But what I was taught, 'cause I used to be a homeopath and I've trained in lots of different magical practices, but homeopathy seemed to be the one that is kind of like the medicine that I'm here for. And I now dose it energetically in a different way to traditional homeopathy, but it's very much kind of the underlying kind of lineage of the path that I'm creating here in this path. And one of the things when I studied homeopathy was that I was taught that it had this kind of unique philosophy that was kind of created differently to the way that the modern allopathic system works. And I was taught that essentially science has created the way that we measure magic, which is what you're saying there. But it also kind of told us that magic is not able to be measured because it doesn't kind of work in a linear, logical way. And it sometimes feels that in that way, and you may be able to show me differently, it sometimes has felt that magical technologies like homeopathy can be difficult to measure in the way that science would traditionally like. And what I mean by that, I suppose, is that if you gave, say, you talked about double-blind kind of experiments. If you say gave a homeopathic remedy to 500 people and you kind of wanted to see the same effect, that wouldn't necessarily work because homeopathy works on a very kind of individualized basis. So those 500 people would likely need one of 3,500 different remedies. So I guess the point is that science's approach can seem to magic, some magical things, quite reductionist in the way that they measure. So I was curious to ask you what you feel about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so maybe one of the reasons why I've been successful in studying these kinds of phenomena, because it is absolutely true that they're subtle. It's similar to homeopathy in that the effect can be subtle. So my first two academic degrees are in electrical engineering, physics, computer science, but my doctorate's in psychology. And so if you approach this from the point of view of what we can say is a hard scientist, somebody who deals with the physical world primarily, it's very easy to gain the assumption that things should be easily repeatable. And in fact, our technologies wouldn't work unless it was true, right? We need high repeatability in order to be able to say, well, this is absolutely true, and now we can turn it into some sort of thing. But the moment you start looking into the psychological realm, we're talking about issues of cognition and perception, memory, and then even worse in the medical realm, you immediately discover that there's huge variability among all of these properties in people. Well, magic, psychic phenomena are all about what people are doing in their head. It's all about the application of intention and attention. And to make things worse, it's not only different from one person to the next, it's different from moment to moment. So people who have done research on meditation, for example, you can take somebody who's learning meditation and teach them what to do, and they'll be able to meditate for about a minute, and then they start thinking about cheeseburgers. So this is even true among highly experienced meditators, that this notion of mind wandering is simply part of the hardware, apparently, of the mind and the brain. That's how we're constructed. Our minds will want to wander. It's very difficult to prevent it from wandering. So the difference between a new meditator and a long-term meditator is that the long-term meditator recognizes when the mind wants to wander and brings it back. So an exceptionally long-term and talented meditators, they kind of get out of that after a while. They recognize that the mind wandering is about to happen, and they can prevent it. So they can maintain a very one-pointed mind or awareness for long periods of time. That is quite unusual, even among experienced meditators. Most meditators will start to mind wander very quickly. And then the goal is to recognize that it happened and to come back. So it takes a lot of practice to do that. So now take that problem and apply it to a phenomenon which involves focused awareness. Not in a meditative state, but focused awareness in a psychic state, which again, I'm going to equate magic and psychic. It's the same thing. So if you're trying to do clairvoyance or you're doing precognition or something, you need to maintain a certain degree of focus long enough to be able to get the information. Most people don't have practice in that. They don't know what to do. Most people, when trying to do that, will immediately start generating fantasies. And it's very easy to then travel down with the fantasy. It's like a daydream, and you get lost in it. And then after a while, you realize, oh, what am I doing? I should be doing that instead. So it takes a lot of practice. It also takes talent. Some people are very talented and are able to achieve extraordinary mental states pretty quickly. That's unusual. Just like it's unusual to have natural sports talent, and you'll know as a teenager that you're going to the Olympics. Well, that doesn't happen very often. So the same is true in this domain. And what that means is that if you want to study a subtle perceptual effect, there's two ways of doing it. One way is that you pull in anybody who happens to be around. It's recruiting by convenience. So this is typical in the academic world, where psychology students need credit for their course, and they'll sign up to do an experiment, and they have no interest in it. They just do it because they get credit. Even under those conditions, for example, in telepathy tests, you still find evidence that's not chance and has been strictly excluding fraud, and it excludes all of the usual mundane explanations for why one person's experience would be felt by another person. If you select people based on their prior experience with spontaneous telepathy, or between closely emotionally bonded people or identical twins, they get much, much, much better effects in the laboratory under those controlled conditions than students selected at random. So you need to have the appreciation of statistics as a way of seeing signal through the noise. These effects are not anywhere near as repeatable as what you see in the physical, just purely physical effects. And it's understandable why somebody who doesn't have an appreciation of the variability in psychology or in psychological performance, why they would become suspicious. Well, why did you need 700 people to do this experiment, and you end up with this tiny little effect, which is statistically really significant, but the effect size is not that big. To which I would say, well, look at drug tests. You need tens of thousands of people and in a treatment condition and a placebo condition, and you might end up with a 5% difference between the two. If you're lucky, maybe a 3% difference between those two conditions. And that's enough to show, because of the statistics, that it actually has a real effect. People don't seem to have a problem with that in medicine, but they do have a problem when it comes to other kinds of phenomena. The same would then be encountered in homeopathy. The right thing for the right person at the right time can work. It'll do something. A lot of people, it won't do anything. And so somebody would look at that data and say, well, this is so subtle, maybe it's not even real. Well, no, there are lots of subtle things that are quite real, but you need to appreciate the way that those kinds of things are studied in order to understand it.
I love that so much. So I guess my question is it, I guess you measure scientifically. So I guess my question is something around, like, how important is it to measure something like homeopathy scientifically, or is there another way that we can come to know its truth, if that makes sense? I don't know if that does make sense, but I think you know what I mean.
Well, there's a lot to be said for faith, right? Your belief in something pushes the placebo effect, and we know that the placebo effect is very strong. The way that it's simply opening your mind to the possibility of something happening, it is much more likely to happen, purely for psychological reasons. So it's important. If you want to know whether something is real independent of belief, that's when you need to start looking at things like double-blind methods and measurements, objective measurements, if you can get them. That increases your confidence that the thing that you're testing is real in an objective way. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be real subjectively, but maybe that you're the only person in the world who can see something. Well, is that real or not? It's real for you, but we want to know, is it real in the consensus? Is it real for everyone? That's generally what we mean by real. It's real for everyone, not just you.
Yeah.
If it's only real for you, then you could be labeled delusional, right? Nobody else can see the ghost. You're the only one. So it's probably not there. That's why the consensus is so important. And that's why science rests upon consensus to determine what will we accept as being a real thing. So that's why in my book, Real Magic, what I'm talking about is when you do experiments that have been repeated by other people and get more or less the same results, and then you do a meta-analysis to combine all of that data, you can make a judgment as to whether something, even a very subtle thing, is actually real or not. So that's why I have confidence saying that a whole range of different kinds of psychic abilities are in fact real. Doesn't
I
require
love
special
that.
people. It only requires a lot of repetition by independent laboratories getting more or less the same effect. If the effect isn't gigantic, it doesn't matter. It's still the same thing seen again and again. So that makes it consensually real.
I love that. So what you're saying is it is important to measure it with science, and it's also possible to measure it with science.
Oh, yeah, it is possible, and we actually get interesting results.
Yeah, I love that. There's something in that around what I've seen very much as you were speaking to there. Because it feels like what you were also speaking to there was kind of the conscious and intentional use of magic. And it feels like that's something that I've seen. Like when people say homeopathy, let's stick with that example. When people go to a homeopath, they're essentially consciously and intentionally choosing into being open to magic. And I remember reading a thing once where I think some protesters had gone into a chemist here and like literally just dosed themselves with a whole bottle of homeopathic remedies off the shelf once, and they were like, it's all rubbish, it didn't work. And that's the real difference for me, is that they have gone in not being consciously and like open to intentionally harnessing the magic of those remedies in that instance. And that's something I've really started to see, particularly with the journeys that I do with women where I'm energetically dosing them. They have to like fully consciously and intentionally work with the remedy in order for anything to actually be created, any magic to be expressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you take a bottle of arsenic, it will kill you. If you take a bottle of homeopathic arsenic, it won't.
So I love that. Yeah.
If you're coming at this from the point of view that the only things that are real will hit you over the head like a sledgehammer, well, then, yeah. I mean, I can understand why somebody say, well, this homeopathy doesn't work because, look, I could take a whole bottle. It doesn't do anything, except maybe it has sugar in it, so it'll give you a sugar high. Well, that's denial of the existence of subtle effects. And in particular, in medicine, the idea that energetic effects or informational effects are still real. They don't operate the same way that a pill, typical drug, will work, but it does work. It works in a different way. It generally will work slower, not always. Sometimes in an acute thing, homeopathy can be extremely fast, but it generally will work much slower and in a more subtle way than an allopathic type drug. So people have to be open to the possibility that that is real. If they're not open to it, then they're going to find all kinds of reasons to convince themselves that it doesn't do anything. There are some people now, I know a person who has studied homeopathy quite extensively, and he thinks that actually that there is a kind of an underlying physical phenomenon in homeopathy that involves nanoparticles.
Yes.
So, I mean, up until recently, we didn't even know that there was such a thing. But even with an enormous amount of succussion and then dilution, you still have something of the original even after many dilutions. And so those nanoparticles might actually do something. And so that's his theory about what's going on, because it is one step closer to what we think of as ordinary science. It's science at the leading edge because nanoparticles are a thing now, but not everybody knows about that. So the idea of the other thing here is people who are using microdosing of psychedelics. So somebody might think, well, if I take a psychedelic, but it's only like one smidgen of it, why would it do anything? Well, it does do things. It actually can be quite effective to have extremely small amounts of psychedelics taken on a daily basis for things like depression. For some people, it works amazingly well. In those cases, I don't know yet whether they've done studies with placebos, like a placebo. I know that there are some homeopathics which are made from psychedelics. I've taken some before, and I didn't notice anything. So maybe I didn't take it long enough, or I didn't take enough. I don't know what, but
maybe it wasn't the remedy for you.
It might not have been. It was considered. Homeopath figured out that my constitutional
Mm.
homeopathic
Oh, yeah, that'd be.
would be based on psilocybin. So there's some name, I don't remember what it was, but some homeopathic thing that was psilocybin, which is like an extreme version of microdosing. And I didn't notice any change from that. So I don't know what to make of
Interesting.
that. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I was trying to figure out what your constitution would be, and felt quite sulfuric to me. Is that kind of yeah. Interesting. Let's not go there. That we could talk about that for ages. But um, yeah, I had heard that about the nanomedicine actually. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I guess there's what springs to mind there is that almost like we haven't yet in every case, although we're being able to measure magic, it's not that we've necessarily got all the tools and the knowledge to be able to measure some aspects of that yet, is what I'm hearing and you saying.
Yeah, we know very, very little both about underlying mechanisms and probably is something maybe not mechanistic in the sense of reductive materialism, but some kind of way of thinking about what's going on here that doesn't make it just completely like a story, right? I mean, there's some very strange aspects to these kinds of phenomena, like the use of symbols. You know, you make a sigil. Well, the sigil is an easy way of focusing your attention. Is it more than that? Well, there are people doing studies where you take some kind of a biological system, and on that you put a label that says healthy, and you have the same system and you have a label that literally has the word unhealthy. And then and then you let the thing grow, the cell culture, and you find that there are differences. Well, was this due to the fact that you knew that this one said healthy and this one said not healthy? Could you do it like within a language that you don't know? You know, if you don't know Chinese, you have somebody write in Chinese healthy and another one is not healthy, and you stick that on there. Will that have an effect, given that the experimenter doesn't know? Well, those experiments haven't been done yet, to my knowledge. But if they did work, it would suggest that there's something about information, about symbology, about semiotics in general, that is affecting the nature of the physical world. Well, that, from a scientific perspective, is crazy. There's no way in the world that could happen. And yet there's some evidence that it does work. So, you know, we're faced with phenomena that science doesn't really have the right tools yet to figure out how to study these things. But I think we'll eventually get there. I mean, if you look at the leading edge of quantum mechanics today, a lot of effort is being placed on quantum information science because it's used in quantum computing and so on. Well, quantum information science is talking about a description of reality which is not physical anymore. It's something much closer to the magical way of thinking about the world, which is really we're all held together by some kind of relationship information, like symbolism, like semiotics. Like, well, suddenly we're now talking about the edge of magic, except that we have the mathematics to go along with it, and we can make things. We can make technologies out of this. So we're at the very beginning, I think, of a scientific way of beginning to understand how information manipulated in the right way can give rise to all kinds of interesting things. And it's taken science 500 years to get to this point. And if you were to ask somebody 100 years ago, or actually now more like 120 years ago, if you were to ask physicists in general about what we take for granted now, about entanglement, non-locality, and so on, they would say that you are delusional. That is impossible. So a century hence from now, we're doing things today that people know that works, like magic, which today many scientists will say you're delusional. Then we will, in the future, have some kind of an explanation where they will say instead, oh, well, we didn't know that such and such existed. And so that's why people didn't believe in it. Just like physicists 100 years ago didn't believe anything about quantum mechanics or relativity. It was just not something that was imagined at that point. So there will be new imaginative breakthroughs that eventually will lead, I think, we will converge towards a worldview where what we currently call the esoteric worldview and the scientific worldview will begin to merge. So maybe
I love that.
maybe we're 100 years away, maybe we're 1,000 years away. I don't know how long it takes to get there. But if you look historically, we're not dealing in parallel tracks. We're dealing with tracks that are pointing slightly towards each other and will eventually converge.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that so much. And yeah, really kind of, yeah, really for me, there's just something about how once when I was kind of deep in my secret witch wounding and like all that pushing away science, it really feels like there's a place where there can be that kind of union. And that feels, yeah, quite reassuring. I think reassuring is maybe not the right word, but there's something good about it anyway.
Well, the reason why I think it's good is because science is very, very good in studying certain kinds of things. It gets
Yes.
rid of human biases and all, our
Yeah.
wishes and so on. It's not quite up to studying a whole range of different kinds of things. Like now it's okay to talk about UFOs, or if we call them UAPs. We can agree that there's something weird happening, but we don't know what it is. We don't even have the right tools yet to begin to study it. Unlike magic, we're way ahead of,
Yeah.
at least with magic, of knowing, yeah, this stuff is real and we know little bits about it. But there's lots of phenomena out there that science simply hasn't caught up to yet. And so, that doesn't mean we don't pay attention to the rest of what science tells us, because a lot of it is pretty good,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if science allows us to do this interview at what, 6,000 miles away,
Yeah,
well, so it
absolutely.
works.
Mm,
Eventually, we'll figure out the rest of it. I
yeah.
hope, if humanity lasts that long.
Yeah, I really love that because yeah, and I think it was my partner who really helped me see begin to open my eyes and be like, science isn't all bad, and I was like, oh yeah, so it makes perfect sense that kind of magic is just the stuff that science has yet to explain, but is actually kind of working towards being able to as well, and in this instance can. We've already, yeah, we're already doing it, so that's just made my heart even fuller. There's also something you said there about almost this kind of logic versus being in the mystery, and I'm wondering if that's something that often has people prefer the logic of science and not willing to be in that kind of mystery of magic.
Well, there's a lot of mystery in science as well. It is true that the people who are attracted to the scientific path tend to be more analytical minded and want to see equations and the mathematics and repeatability, all of those kinds of things. That's not always true. I mean, there are plenty of scientists who are very interested in spirituality and in mystical ideas. We learn very quickly, though, and as a scientist or the academic, that you don't talk about that stuff publicly. It's not something that you want to bring up. That doesn't mean it's not there, because all humans are interested in these types of things. So, is there room for mystery? Of course, there's an enormous amount of mystery. As has often been said, I think, in science in particular, this is probably true in scholarship too. This is a phrase I like from Terence McKenna. He's one of the promoters of the psychedelic world. He said, as the bonfires of knowledge grow brighter, the more the darkness is revealed to our startled eyes.
Ooh, I love that.
And that's always going to be the case, right? We are surrounded by things that we don't understand. And the more you begin to look into any topic, the more you really begin to understand it. Also, the more you begin to understand what we don't understand. That's what the darkness that surrounds us, that our startled eyes are suddenly wondering, oh my God, I had no idea what we didn't understand. Well, now I do. And I can also see there's a lot more beyond that. So yeah, we're at the beginning of understanding all kinds of interesting things that we don't even have names for yet.
I love that so much. I know you mentioned about magic playing a key role in exploring the frontiers of science, and I'm just wondering if there's anything more to speak to on that.
Well, that's based on looking at the lives of people who are famous inventors and famous scientists, and seeing that their breakthrough ideas generally were based on intuition. So if you ask them, well, how did you come up with this thing? Well, they had something in a dream, or they simply had an idea that fell out of the sky into their head somehow. And this is true among the historical geniuses in the arts, in music, in science, and scholarship, that they somehow just know something. Well, where is that information coming from? Some of it is coming from a traditional way of thinking about it, that if you spend an enormous amount of time studying something, you will eventually begin to absorb it in a way that you don't have conscious access to everything that you learned. So there's forgotten expertise. And so what often happens, somebody takes a shower, or they go to sleep and have a dream, part of your mind is still working on that. It's not constrained by the usual ways of like anytime you start thinking about something when you're awake, you're constraining how you think about it. But that doesn't happen in dreams, and it doesn't happen in a reverie state. Then you're able to like pull in everything that you know. So that's a conventional way of thinking about intuition. The unconventional way says, well, we also have the capacity to get information that's not constrained by space and time. That's what we call psychic. We can do that. Some people can do it better than others. And if you're working really hard to solve some sort of problem that no one else has solved before, sometimes people will admit that they get what they'll call the download, that the universe just sort of dumps the whole thing into your head, and you can take the next 10 years figuring out what that means. Like you get a solution to some amazing thing, but it's so complicated that you have to sort of piece it all apart and figure out, well, what was that? What did I just learn? And sometimes it's obvious, and most of the time it's not so obvious. Well, that's a different kind of intuition. That's the intuition that separates a prominent person from a genius that changes the world.
Mm.
Right? Nobody had to teach Mozart as a child to sit down and compose symphonies. He would describe, and Brahms and many other composers would say, I would hear the entire thing in my head, right? It's just there. The whole thing is perfect. So when Mozart would write down what he did, he didn't have any mistakes in it. He didn't change anything. He wrote down what was there. This is not normal intuition. This is something that when that kind of information comes through, it lasts, in this case, for centuries, because you recognize it as, holy smoke, what does that come from? Well, it comes from somewhere else, some other time or place. And so there's the difference. Is there value of that in science? Absolutely.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. And just brought to mind they're really trusting ourselves as well, when we're trusting our intuition as well. It's funny, actually, it was having this conversation this morning. My 2-year-old daughter, when I woke up, I said to her, what are you going to do today? And she said, and she doesn't speak, she's just learning to speak. She said, oh, I'm going to Liss and playing with acorns. And I was like, okay. And the next minute, when she'd gone, I got a photo through from the childminder who's called Liz, and she sent me a picture, and she's like, oh, Lily's playing with acorns. I was like, hang on a minute, did you tell her this yesterday? She's like, no, we only decided it this morning. I'm like, okay, good. She is a magical one then. So yeah, magic. Are we all magical?
We are all magical in the sense that we are sentient beings. So I think every sentient creature has access to whatever this is. But talent does play a role as well. Talent and practice. Not everybody will win at Wimbledon. It doesn't matter how much you want to. If your body is not able to do it, or you can't mentally play at that level, then you can't do that. Everyone wants to think that they can do anything that they want, but there are real physical constraints as well, physical and mental constraints. So we simply have to acknowledge that and recognize that in this domain, there are many, many different ways that you can express abilities. Somebody might be a really good healer, and that's it, that they can't do anything else. Somebody else might be really good at divination and they can't do anything else. So one of the things that we developed at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is where I work, is a noetic inventory, which comes up with 12 different, you take a questionnaire and it pops out 12 different characteristics that you may have, which would show that you could be really good in this thing, but maybe not so good in these other things. So that's,
I want to
it's
take
like
that
a
quiz
snapshot
now.
of your ability, called the Noetic Science Inventory.
Ah, I will be looking that up. That's yeah, it's interesting because again, with the women that I work with, I often talk about how you talked about having a talent. I think there is a certain almost predisposed, we call it constitution. So I talk about my women being phosphoric constitution a lot. And essentially, phosphoric women have kind of got those gifts that are magical. So that's why I asked that question, because it feels like, and again, there's lots of different remedies that can be magical, but it's not always something that everybody has a particular gift for. And yeah, I can also see that we are all kind of, it's available to all of us to be magic, if that makes sense. But there's I guess there's certain people have more openness, more predisposition to those gifts, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. We all have these experiences spontaneously. The difference between the high talents and the rest of us is that they can either learn or they naturally know how to use it on demand. That's really the big difference, because spontaneous telepathy and spontaneous synchronicities and all that, that's very, very common. Most people have that at least once. We did a survey among academic scientists and engineers, asking them which one of 25 different kinds of psychic abilities, or at least psychic experiences, that they had personally encountered. We thought, well, I don't know, maybe 50% might say yes, it's anonymous, so they had no reason to lie. But it was 94%. 94% of academic scientists and engineers have had at least one of 25 experiences that would be called psychic.
Oh my goodness.
So that's like basically everyone. It's the person who doesn't have any of those experiences becomes the outlier. Everyone else is having something. So this really does say that the experiences are available to us, whether we could use them or not in a conscious, intentional way is another matter.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually. Wow, that's mind-blowing, the percentage there. Wow. I would love to know a little bit more about what you have discovered from measuring magic. Like, is there anything like really juicy that we haven't talked about that you feel would be really exciting for us to know about your discoveries?
Well, from a scientific perspective, the very existence of these phenomena is already so shocking that you don't even know we need to go beyond that. Right? It is a real phenomenon. What is also a little bit surprising to me, although not so much after that survey I did, is how many people in pretty prominent positions within the scientific community are very, very interested in this. Like they either practice the magic or they've had very strange experiences. They're very interested, but in academia, it's still pretty constrained and closed on what you're able to talk about. I know about this because they know what I'm interested in, and so they talk to me about it. This is true among business leaders, people in government, people in the academic world. It's like everywhere. It really is esoteric in the sense of being like in your face, but hidden at the same time. It's like everywhere, but nobody talks about it. It's so strange.
Which is perfect, so that's the secret witch.
It is, yeah. And I think one of the goals here would be to make it not so secret anymore. You know, we have the capacity to learn a lot more about it. There's one other thing I should mention which is that the notion of magic means that you have more capacity and more power to do what you want to do. Power is always seductive. And we're talking about a power here which has a degree of seduction which can make it unethical very quickly. So the ethics of this power is important to be aware of. And I'll give an example. So one of the people I know is a practicing witch. So she watches a TikTok show where there's a high school science teacher who seems to feel that it's his mission in life to debunk things that people don't believe in. So like if somebody believes in a flat earth, spends a lot of time talking about why those people are stupid. And if they don't believe in vaccines, he'll do that. And if they don't believe in this and that, whatever. So she watched that show because he was entertaining. Then one day he said, well, people who believe in psychic phenomena are delusional and stupid because they don't understand science. She got angry and she decided that she's going to teach him a lesson. So she figured that the easiest way to reach him would be through his dreams. And so she injected into a dream telepathically that he felt some kind of alarm and his life was in danger and he needed to get out of the house. Well, 2 days later on TikTok, he actually talked about that dream. He said he had this weird dream. He couldn't quite tell if he was awake, if he's sleeping, but he felt it like there was an alarm going off and maybe it was something like monoxide and he needed to get out of the house, but he couldn't move because he felt paralyzed, on and on and on.
Wow.
He clearly had a strong experience shortly after this witch did something to him. Well, and she said then that she knows that this is right on the edge of being morally not correct because it actually is on the edge of black magic. Black magic is using your ability to override somebody else's free will. So this is part of the training I would hope that somebody would go through if they're learning these methods, to be really mindful about how you're using these magical abilities and what the consequences are for other people. Because you don't want to go down that path. It's so seductive that you have to fight against it.
Yeah, there's a quote, I think, by, I think it's Aleister Crowley, about love under will. And that always feels to me like the most important thing for my women who are secret witches to have, as like, it's one of the principles essentially of the work that I do, is like that coming from love, harnessing your power from love. So I'm really glad that you presence that, actually, because again, it's part of the reason why there is this kind of fear in the world about magic, I think, is that, like you say, it can be misused. And often actually, when the secret witch is kind of unconscious of her power, it's likely that she's misusing it on herself as well. Like if we're not conscious of the power that we actually have, it'll be misused in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, against yourself and against others. And so there's a subtlety here, which is interesting. Like, let's say somebody is feeling ill and you want to help them. Well, can you help them without asking their permission? From a magical tradition, the answer is no. You need to get their permission, because otherwise you're doing something to them that they may not want you to do. So the notion of informed consent, which of course is necessary in any kind of human experimentation and in the real world, it probably should be thought of as being also true in this magical world. That if you're going to do something that, even if it's purely beneficial for somebody else, you still need to get their permission, because they may not want it.
I love that so much. It's really funny, again, magic, really, that you've just presenced that, because I've started to realize as I started to energetically dose the remedies, that I was kind of doing it without that warning for some time. And obviously when I'm dosing my women in the crucibles that they come into, then they're kind of, that is a conscious choice. But as I was talking in my group and energetically kind of speaking about the remedies and bringing them to life, I had to start putting in like a warning of like, you don't listen to this unless you actually want to consciously harness the remedy that I'm talking about, because that is literally how my medicine works, and I can't really help it. It's like me just bringing the remedy alive is by the very, very nature dosing them. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that's really powerful, actually.
Yeah, anytime you learn any new information about the nature of reality, it can be used for good or bad. So that moral dimension should always be part of any training and even any practice. And it's kind of built into the nature of science now, because there are so many abuses in the past that anybody who's doing scientific research has to follow guidelines that protect humans and animals in research for that purpose, because it's just so easy to say, well, we don't need that, and just go ahead and override somebody else's free will. Well, that's a no-no.
Yeah, gorgeous. So, just before we complete, I know you have some exciting projects that you're working on at the moment. So I'm just wondering if there's anything you would particularly want to share with us around that, and as we end.
New exciting projects. Well, one thing I'm working on with a pretty large group of people and taking place in the Netherlands is trying to visualize the human biofield. So otherwise known as subtle energies, energy medicine, all those other names for it. There's some kind of energetic around the body. And in conventional instruments don't pick it up. You could use all kinds of things that measure bioelectromagnetic stuff, and it's not that, it's something else. So I've developed a new kind of sensor that might be able to pick up something like that, something like an informational field. And they've run a bunch of experiments. They're doing all of the tests are being done in the Netherlands. I just sent the sensors over there. And so I'm analyzing now the possibility that there is something like an informational field that surrounds each of us, which would not be picked up by any conventional instrument. I'm using another kind of sensor that is responsive to changes in information, and it seems to be working. It's picking up something. So if you project another 10 years or something after we begin to learn more about this, we might be able to pick up something that actually would visualize what clairvoyants say they see as an aura. Now, we don't know if it's the same thing or not, but there's enough people who talk about auras and images and something around the body that maybe we can eventually develop an instrument that would reliably pick that up. And if that were possible, then as a diagnostic tool, maybe as a healing tool, there's all kinds of very interesting things that could be done. And this then is similar to what I was saying before, that as science progresses, we're taking all kinds of speculative ideas and trying to instantiate them and then applying them for practical purposes. So in this case, the practical purpose is healing. And where the device I made is purely based on speculation. I didn't know that it was going to do anything, but it does seem to be picking something up. So that's one of about, I'm looking at my list here of, what do I have, like 15 projects?
Wow.
About 15 projects in different stages of development. So that's one that I happen to be working on right now.
Wow, that's so exciting. And that really fills my heart because one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and that often my women will come to my doors feeling quite like they've trained in all the magical healing, and then they've kind of put it back in the box because it's not accepted by the mainstream. So what you're speaking to there is like exactly what I am passionate about, which is making healing magical again. So that feels really, really exciting. Yeah.
There's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that methods like Reiki and Joray and therapeutic touch and those things, they do work. They work both locally and they work at a distance. They're not well accepted. I mean, in some places, like close-up therapeutic touch is actually practiced in a lot of hospitals because it makes the patients feel better, even though we don't really understand how it works. But the moment that we suggest that, oh, by the way, the practitioner doesn't need to be near the patient. They could be 10 miles away and it would still work. That is thoroughly rejected because we have no idea how that's going to work other than something like quantum entanglement or some exotic thing like that. But nevertheless, just the empirical evidence, the medical evidence suggests that does work. And so, this is how science progresses. Somebody observes something and said, well, how does that work? I mean, like the whole history of science is this. You see something, what is that? Well, we don't know what that is. You collect an enormous amount of observational data to figure it out. And then somebody comes up with a theory, and then you test the theory, and the theory turns out to be pretty good, not perfect. And this cycle just keeps going until at some point you get so good, your theory is so good and your data is so good that you can say, okay, we know enough now, we can turn it into something practical. So when it comes to something like energetic healing or psychic healing, we're at the beginning of that cycle. We kind of know that it exists, and we have reasonably good evidence. We don't know what's going on. So we're in the speculative phase.
So we're in the mystery. I love it. I love it. Magical. Excellent. Well, where can people find you to learn more about your work? I think I'll put it in the show notes, but if you just let people know, I'm sure they're going to want to explore more.
Well, my name is Dean Radin, and so if you go to deanradin.com, you'll find my personal website where I have, among other things, I list most of the events and podcasts and things that I've done. It's approaching 700 by now. And also most of the publications that I had in journals, most of which you can download from the website. And then also a bunch of information about my books. And where I work is the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is noetic.org. And there you can find out the kinds of things that we've been doing almost for 50 years now, which is in exploring these kinds of experiences that people have and trying to understand them through the tools of science.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been so, I want to say another word other than magical, but it does actually feel deeply magical, this conversation. So thank you from my heart for all that you do, because it feels just so liberating for all magical ones. And yeah, it's nourishing for the world as well. So yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.